We clearly waited too long to come to Vancouver. Thank you. Amazing.
So a quick rundown on this evening's event. There's a couple microphones set up. We will be getting to questions from you guys a little later on. We're going to chat for, however long we feel like it, but we want to make sure there's time for questions after that. So good to see you both again.
Yeah, likewise.
I'm really enjoying kind of this series of events, and I thought today we'd start off in a different direction that's all about me. No. It's actually a question that I think both of you are going to have really good input on. I did a debate a couple weeks ago against a preacher who seemed to have not only no understanding of science, but no appreciation for it, didn't care if he was fairly representing it. As a matter of fact, I think there's a chance you might have stood up and accosted him at some point, because he literally stood in front of me and said, "Oh, that evolution stuff, it's not like anybody's ever banged sticks and rocks together and got a puppy." He said this twice during the debate. The first time, we're in a debate structure, so I'm trying not to interrupt. I need to follow the rules of the debate. And the second time, I just halted and jumped right in, and I was like, "You're right, that's never happened, and no scientist has ever portrayed anything like that happening." And luckily, we were in high school, and the students seemed to get it. But how do we work past not only just willful scientific ignorance, but we seem to have built communities where we haven't instilled any appreciation for it or any appreciation to treat it reasonably. Let's just throw up a straw man and call it nonsense.
I don't often quote Tony Blair. But he said, education, education, education. There is staggering ignorance of what evolution is all about. And, hello?
I think we're living in a simulation right now, and it's failing us. So, Richard, what do you do with this underlying misunderstanding of the role of randomness in evolution? Can you inoculate us against that problem?
Mutation is random, only in one sense, actually. Mutation is random only in the sense that it's not directed towards improvement, specifically. It's non-random in other senses. Natural selection is quintessentially non-random. That's exactly what natural selection is. Anybody who thinks that you could possibly explain the beauty and the elegance of living things by some kind of random process would be stark raving bonkers. Anybody who thinks that we think that has got to be stark raving bonkers. Of course it's not random. The whole point of the scientific enterprise in this case is to find an escape from randomness, is to find a solution to the problem of how you get these staggeringly non-random things which are living creatures out of the laws of physics. And that's what we're about. I mean, to explain that by postulating a creator, now that is in almost resorting to randomness. That's saying that complexity, non-randomness is another word for complexity, comes into being spontaneously by sheer luck. God just happened to be there. What natural selection, what evolution does, is to explain how you get there from simple beginnings, which are easy to understand, and how you work up gradually up a kind of ramp of improvement until you get to complexity. That's the whole point. We're trying to escape from randomness, and natural selection is the only escape that anybody has ever suggested that will work.
It strikes me, I was thrilled that the students, this was in a public high school, although I believe it was a charter school, because it's going to be unlikely that a regular state-sponsored public school is going to invite me in to debate a preacher, although it was a debate class. But I was inspired that the students seemed to catch on to what was going on, so at least I'm a little optimistic that they were reasonably educated on the subject. But how do we deal with adults, this minister? He's not going to go back to school. He's not going to pay any attention to us.
What did he actually say? I didn't quite hear the final word of what he said.
He portrayed evolution as if scientists were saying, that you bang sticks and rocks together and you get a puppy. That sort of ridiculous over the top. So that's going to be a meme, that face right there.
I'm just lost for words.
Although, truth be told, the details of procreation are almost that strange. I mean, if you've ever had a child, and I mean, it could not be more alien. If we watched a horror movie, and this is how the aliens produced their offspring, it could not be made stranger than it is. That was not an anti-sex tirade, by the way. That was just...
If anyone thinks that the great majority of scientists are so utterly idiotic and naive that they think that that the way you get life is by banging sticks together and stones together, I mean, doesn't it give him pause to think that actually the vast majority of scientists have a fully coherent theory that fills library shelves of volumes of books about it? If it was that simple, if we're just banging sticks together, that's not the way it would work.
But what do you do with the underlying improbability of the whole process getting started in the first place? The tornado going through a junkyard and assembling a fully working 747 argument.
The first step, the origin of the first self-replicating molecule, the origin of the first gene, that was a necessary first step before natural selection could get started. And that is a step that nobody has yet solved. There are quite a lot of theories about it. We may never know for certain, because it happened a very long time ago. We know the kind of thing that must have happened. And that is a big barrier. That is one of the main questions that remains. Once that's happened, that was a fairly simple start. Once that's happened, then the whole panoply of life, the whole branching, complexifying beauty of life then gets going. We do need a theory of the origin of life. But once that starts, then everything else follows with great logic and persuasiveness.
And of course, until we get to the point where we have a good understanding, then the answer that we should give is we don't know yet, rather than pretending that we do and that there's some, godlike governing force.
Exactly. I mean, scientists are we like to say we don't know because that gives us something to do.
It's incredibly good job security for the curious. One of the things that troubled me is all of us have dealt with religious-minded individuals in debate-type formats. Here's a preacher who knew nothing, and it was proudly on display. And there's a part of me that says, should this individual be allowed to speak to children at all? And yet I have to defend this idea of freedom of expression, that people get to share their ideas. And that puts us in a place where we're constantly in a battle of ideas. How badly informed should somebody be before we just stop paying attention to them and work on the people who perhaps are reachable?
Well, the problem in that case is that the preacher represents, in the U.S., 35%, 45%, depending on what his convictions are, of the population. So it's not, you can ignore the preacher, but you can't ignore the fact that a significant minority, and on some questions a majority of Americans hold just patently absurd ideas. So it's the ideas that really matter.
He knew nothing, but he was proud of knowing nothing, it sounds to me. A lot of us are ignorant of lots of things. I mean, I'm ignorant of very many things, and I'm sure you are as well. But we don't pontificate.
I've never heard it put so nicely.
We don't. But we admit when we're ignorant, and we don't try to pontificate about things of which we know nothing. Whereas he was doing exactly that.
In a way, it wasn't so much that I don't think he thinks he's ignorant. I don't think he's proud of his ignorance. I think he thinks he's convinced he has the right answer, and that we are all engaged in a scientific fairy tale. So there's like an extra layer of smug superiority over the top of it, where he gets to dismiss the work of countless scientists that have taught us the best current understanding of the diversity of life, and it gets to shrug it off with sticks and rocks.
Well,
And-
if we ever have to convene gatherings like this in hell, we'll know we did something wrong.
I'm pretty sure a part of that was in hell, but I maintain my composure.
I mean, that really is the thing. That's what completely changes the equation. The moment you believe you are certain, or even just have very good reason to believe, that this life is just a way station on the way to some eternity that you could get very, very wrong or very, very right, depending on what you believe. Just that being your master algorithm, that makes a mockery of every pretense to human knowledge, no matter how technologically useful it is. It doesn't matter if we cure cancer with some future biology and prayer has never worked. If you believe in heaven and hell, that really governs everything, it seems.
In a way, I don't think I mind his believing what he believes. What I mind is his thinking we believe what he thinks we believe.
Yes.
Because how could anybody be so stupid as to think that you can...
He simultaneously presented a straw man of evolution and evolutionary scientists and anybody who fell into that, I accept reality. I'm going to straw man you all with sticks and rocks. Now, we can laugh at it, and, if you feel like laughing at it some more, by all means. There's been lots of discussion about how best to engage on these. How much, for lack of a better phrase, how big of an asshole should you be? How much pushback should there be? How seriously should you take them? And quite frequently, someone will come up and present the idea that there are sophisticated theologians, that this preacher that I had a debate with is in one category, and some other academic, erudite theologians are in another category. Is that the case?
Well, there are sophisticated theologians who accept evolution, of course, and have no problem with that. And so our argument with them is a quite separate argument. I have met sophisticated theologians who believe pretty astonishing things, like believing literally that Jesus turned water into wine. And I thought sophisticated theologians had written all that stuff off and said, oh no, that's just metaphor, that's just a nice story, we don't really believe that anymore. But I have spoken to very, very highly qualified, sophisticated theologians, highly educated. They accept evolution totally, but yet they think Jesus turned water into wine and walked on water and rose from the dead and was born of a virgin. All very unscientific ideas, and still they call themselves sophisticated theologians.
Well, first we should acknowledge that sophistication is better insofar as it means moderation and less of a commitment to the most dangerous ideas. But my problem with so-called sophisticated theology is that no one ever admits where the sophistication is coming from. It's coming from a loss of faith in specific doctrines. I mean, it's getting hammered into them from the outside. So it's coming from science and a modern conception of ethics, a universal conception of human rights, a sense of how unseemly it is to think that anyone, by virtue of being born in the wrong place, is going to spend eternity in hell just because they didn't happen to hear the good word from their parents. So they lose their purchase on those dogmas, and yet they retain this conviction that Jesus was born of a virgin or was resurrected and will be coming back. And those are just it's a God of the gaps argument in certain cases, but there's just certain questions where science hasn't yet closed the door to belief, and so they're putting all of their chips on those questions.
We might have slightly different views of what a sophisticated theologian is, which is probably a testament to how it's actually not sophisticated theology, but obfuscated theology. Because when I hear someone say, you take calls on the atheist experience and you get people who couldn't present a reasonable argument at all. Why don't you take on real sophisticated theologians? And my answer is always tell them to call in. Here's the phone number. They can call in whatever week they want. And they'll say, well, but here's this, academic who's presented this particular version of the ontological argument, the moral argument. And it's, you've got Ray Comfort, the banana man, on one hand, and they pretend that there's something superior with regard to argumentation on the other. And at the many years I've been hosting the show and doing debates, what I find is what gets labeled as sophisticated theology is the exact same thing. It's not like the arguments of these sophisticated theologians are any more sound than the arguments of Ray Comfort. It's just that they're better speakers.
They're actually less sound in one way, in that they don't. So the belief system is still anchored to a belief in revelation. They're still fixated on the texts, but they have ignored much of what seems untenable in the texts, and they don't have an argument about why that's okay. Because if God wrote any of these books, and nowhere in the book does God say, well, you could ignore the first half because now I'm getting to the good part. It's all God's word. So it's actually a less principled position than fundamentalism. And that's why it's always, in my view, unstable in the face of fundamentalism, because the fundamentalist always has the advantage of saying, listen, I'm going to read the whole book. I'm going to take the most plausible interpretation of it. I'm going to read every word as literally as possible. And that always begins to fixate on more divisive, more doctrinaire, more irrational ideas.
At least with a fundamentalist, you know what you're arguing against.
Yeah.
You're not arguing against a wet sponge.
No, it seems perverse to say it, but there's actually more integrity to the most fundamentalist position, because there's simply one irrational move, which is the belief that this book is perfect in every word. But the moment you believe that, well, then it is in fact rational to try to connect all the dots as reasonably as possible.
But sometimes they really don't say anything. They say something like, well, God is the ground of all being.
Right.
Or God is the essence of isness, or something.
Well, I have a soft spot for that kind of
Yes.
I mean, I don't like the theistic version of it, but this is perhaps the only argument I can adduce in favor of so-called sophisticated theology, which is there's an experience that people have, Christian contemplatives, say, or really contemplatives in any tradition, and have had for millennia, which does provoke those sorts of noises from people. I mean, the problem is you get far enough into any of these contemplative traditions, and everyone begins to sound like a Buddhist. And then if you're in the 14th century in Christendom, the Inquisition shows up at your door, as they did to Meister Eckhart, who happily died of natural causes just in time. But there's an experience that people have of losing their sense of self, say, and feeling at one with the universe or the world, or having some kind of ethical, just a full ethical reboot of their hard drive where they feel love that they didn't know was possible, right? A kind of self-transcending love.
Yeah, I'd enjoy that, I think.
Yeah, well, yeah, so...
I'm not sure I would.
We can help.
And I'm not sure that it's a good... What is it that's a good thing about losing one's sense of self?
That's a big question. Well, when you look at just the mechanics of your own suffering, when you look at just what self-concern gets you psychologically, you can begin to feel that most of your suffering is not directly tied to bad things happening. It's tied to this whole machinery of self-concern, anxiety about the future and regret about the past and worries about what people said of you or think of you or will think of you. And so much of our neurosis is taking place just in the conversation we're having with ourselves. And that's all predicated on the legitimacy of this starting point of feeling like there's a self riding around in the head who is carried through from one moment to the next in life. That you are the same person you were yesterday. So the thing that embarrassed you yesterday that you're now remembering and now feels terrible, it's the the psychological continuity there and the durable continuity that seems to mandate that you suffer over precisely the thing that you were suffering over yesterday because you are that same self carried through moment to moment. And
Just have everybody watch Frozen and you can just let it go.
Right, well, yes.
Because I think the sense of self is actually something that's incredibly valuable. That, we have a preservation motivation. We have a desire to understand the world that we inhabit. That is, it may even be the case, as I've argued and others have, that there's no such thing as altruism in a true sense, but that you could have altruism from a purely selfish standpoint and still do good.
Yeah, but I wouldn't call it. I mean, that begins to play with the boundaries of the quote self. I mean, so if the moment you begin to feel that your selfishness extends to everyone being happy, right? Because you actually care about everyone, right? And you feel better when you see people smiling rather than weeping. If you extend the circle of your self-concern to everyone, well, then that's not normal selfishness. That's sainthood in a.
If I'm doing it because I feel good when people smile, that doesn't mean I necessarily care about them. It means I might care about that good feeling that I get.
Yeah, except the I get part is vulnerable to inspection. I mean, in the sense that there's an I who's appropriating that in every moment it's a project which can be accomplished in a moment, or you can fail to accomplish it after many years of looking. But there's the sense that there is it's useful to define what we mean by self, because most people don't feel identical to their bodies. So when I say the self doesn't exist, I'm not saying that people don't exist. I'm not saying that nobody's here and this is all an illusion. And there are contemplative and religious and spiritual traditions that can sound like they're saying something very much like that. I'm saying that the sense that we all have of being a subject in the head, riding around in the body as though it were a kind of vehicle, right? Because this really is most people's starting point. They don't feel truly coterminous with their bodies. They feel like they're in their head and that their hands are down there in some sense. And that sense of being a subject in the head is vulnerable to inspection. You can lose that sense. And on one level, you can just be identified with your body. I mean, that is actually progress. Simply to feel like a body in the world is different from the way most people feel. Most people are kind of, and this is what we're running into. Most people are common sense dualists. They feel like the mind can't possibly be identical to the brain. The mind is something altogether different, and it just feels like it's in the head as there's a sort of locus of attention that's emanating from the head. But this body is a machine that can malfunction, and it's changing over time. It's clearly not what I am, and I am probably a soul then. I'm probably spirit. I can probably drift off the brain at death. And that sense, and all the ways in which that sense can be played with by fasting or prayer or meditation or psychedelics or getting crazy ideas that you find emotionally very animating, sort of adventures you can have in dualism are part of the problem here, because
Adventures in Dualism should be the title of your next book.
Right. Yeah.
I didn't know if you want to jump in on that at all.
I have nothing to contribute. No.
Yeah. I sit here and I listen to this, and I think there's like a 4-hour fascinating for me conversation. You might not think so much, because I have no problem with the idea that the mind is the brain. But I know that there are people who do.
But it doesn't feel that way.
I know it doesn't feel that way. Yeah. And I don't know that it's necessary, and I don't know what the right path is. I don't know that for example, losing this sense of self could be a great thing.
Well, one thing I would add is that you lose it all the time because it actually isn't there. I mean, you are losing it all the time.
How can you lose something that's not there?
It always seems there retrospectively, but when you're really paying attention to something, when you're so-called lost in your work, or you're lost in some athletic task, or you're just lost in thought, you're thinking about something and you're not aware that you're thinking. This sense of our own kind of central presence in our heads is constantly being undercut by attention being diverted to something out in the world or to some experience. And you can become increasingly sensitive to how it's being interrupted. Moment to moment.
I would love to get to the truth, and I love the fact we're on the pursuit, but irrespective of what the truth is, Richard, something like consciousness, which we still, some would say we understand and some would say we don't. I think we don't. But what would be the evolutionary advantage in the process by which we get to consciousness as we have it, as we seem to have it, that might distinguish us from other animals?
It's a big mystery because you could build an animal which did all the sophisticated things animals have to do, hunting for food, avoiding predators, looking for mates, doing everything that an animal has to do in order to survive and propagate its genes. And I don't think it would have to be conscious at all. I think it could all be done in the way that a computer would do it. I mean, when you talk to Siri or Alexa, they sound conscious, but you know they're not. And for an animal to survive with a nervous system, it doesn't, it seems to me, need to be conscious. And I'm very glad I'm conscious, and I'm pretty sure you are as well. I mean, I think other people. I'm not a solipsist, but I do find it a bit of a mystery why we have consciousness at all.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think it's, as I wrote somewhere, it's the one thing in this universe that can't be an illusion, including the universe. I mean, this universe could be a simulation on some alien hard drive.
I think Descartes said something similar.
Yeah.
Although I got 40 emails last week that says we've proved that that's not true, and I don't necessarily buy those emails either.
Yes, that's exactly what the simulators would say if you were. But I mean, consciousness as just the felt sense that something is going on, the fact that there's an experiential quality, whatever this is, whether you're a brain in a vat, whether you're in the matrix, whether consciousness is being produced by information processing in your head, as seems reasonable to believe, consciousness is always the first fact before any other facts can be discussed. And it's also the most important thing in the universe. It's the only thing that makes, at least in my view, it's the only thing that makes the universe important. The fact that the lights are on, the fact that it's possible for the lights to be on. If you told me there's a universe somewhere that's got stars and planets, but the constants of nature are tuned just a little awry so that conscious life is impossible, that is a deeply uninteresting universe. And consciousness is the only ground for any moral dimension to our lives, too. And yet, I'm with you in feeling that it's not clear that it does anything. It's not clear how it would be selected for. Because if you just look at your own experience, everything that you're conscious of, anything that you seem to be consciously deciding, or any place where it seems that consciousness is necessary to integrate information behaviorally, to have a complex goal, say, for someone to say to you, well, you should really get to the Orpheum Theater at 8 o'clock to hear this talk. For that to become a behavioral plan, let's just say that is in fact something that can only be done consciously in apes like ourselves. Still, it's not clear why, well, as you said, it's not clear that should be the only way that it gets accomplished. And we could easily build robots, one presumes, that could do these things without it being something that it's like to be those robots. But even in our own case, if consciousness really is just what it is at the level of our neurophysiology, it's only effective in virtue of what it is at the level of neurophysiology. So the fact that there's a subjective side to it doesn't matter. I mean, the fact that you're having this experience now, which again is the most important thing in anyone's life, the experience side of it is not what is actually behaviorally effective if, in fact, consciousness has the other face, which is its neurophysiology and its information processing dynamics.
Nicholas Humphrey suggested that one of the most important things we have to do is to second-guess other people. We swim through a sea of a social sea. We have to make our way through very, very complicated relationships with other people, and we have to second guess what they're going to do. all the time we're having to predict how this other person is going to react. And so he postulates what he calls the inner eye, which is looking inwards to yourself as an aid to second-guessing what the other person might do. You need this extra sense organ to help you to predict the behavior of the other person. But I still don't think that does it.
Somehow I wouldn't have been as surprised by the last presidential election if I was doing that correctly.
Yeah, and I was here before the election and predicted that there was no way Trump could win. And as somebody who occasionally pretends to read minds and make predictions for a living, boy, was that a mistake. I think what Richard's talking about is something that I've heard elsewhere is the intentional stance. What if it's the case that consciousness, which gives rise to this sense of self, in a way it goes beyond mere self-reflection and consideration, leads us to connections with other people. And this is what provides the evolutionary benefit. But it also leads to something else that I thought we'd talk about, which is tribalism. Our lives as individuals become merged, obviously, with our family. We have this immediate connection to our family, and then we extend this, and we extend the definition of family, and we begin to form tribes. And there was a time and a place where that may have been the best thing. Is it the case that, I mean, obviously, these could all be side effects of just what happened, and I would think that I'd be okay with the idea that consciousness and tribalism and everything are side effects of what happened. You know, there doesn't have to be a guiding hand. But in the process, viewing it from natural selection, what were the benefits of tribalism, and have we actually outgrown them, or are we maybe taking a step back?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, Richard, I think altruism, the evolutionary rationale for altruism really only makes sense in a tribal context. So that like one of the silver linings of internecine tribal conflict was that in-group altruism got selected for. I don't know if there's any recent work on that, but that was my reading of things.
Yes.
Now, that's not to say that we're stuck with tribalism as the only rationale for altruism, but in terms of how apes like ourselves became as altruistic as we are, it's thought that competition among tribes was the basis.
Well,
for
I suppose a Darwinian view of altruism would go back to a time when we lived in small tribal groups. And there were two things about living in these small groups. One was that you were completely surrounded by kin, cousins, second cousins, siblings, nephews and nieces, and so on. And so there would have been a Darwinian incentive to altruism towards anybody you meet, because anybody you meet is a member of your own village, your own tribe, your own clan. And the second thing, the other Darwinian motor of altruism is reciprocation. And reciprocation depends, or largely depends, upon encountering the same individual again and again.
Yeah.
And that again happens within the village, within the band, within the tribe. So there would have been a selection pressure in favor of within-group altruism and out-group hostility, xenophobia. So we can expect that there should be this tendency to despise the out-group and to be altruistic and cooperative with the familiar in-group. And that could be defined as people you've known all your life, people you were brought up with, people who look like you. There are all sorts of ways in which the rule of thumb for how to behave could have latched on. And it's a pretty depressing outlook when we've moved out of our tribal past and moved into big cities where we're no longer in small tribal groups. But we still have the same rules of thumb which work, and that is a good thing. We have a rule of thumb that says just, in general, be nice to anybody, empathize with anybody, because in the distant past, anybody would have been defined as your own tribe, your own clan, your own kin group, your own reciprocation group.
So I wonder if it's to our benefit to there's a couple of potential ways to go there. One is to get everybody to realize that everybody still is part of our clan, that we are one human clan. I don't know. I don't have the magic solution to end the various divisions. But the other is maybe to get people to recognize that they can be a part of a number of different clans that overlap. This is how we build societies.
Right.
You know, I care more about my immediate family than I do my neighborhood, but I care more about my neighborhood than I do, you know, the broader world. But I can't diminish my caring for things outside my scope to zero, because we know that we have an impact on each other, even at great distances.
Peter Singer wrote a book called The Expanding Circle, in which he starts out by talking about this in-group, kin group, and then talks about the altruism broadening itself out to wider and wider and wider groups. And he would like that to include non-human animals as well, that psychologically we can extend our tribal loyalty to all sentient beings.
Yeah.
There were some folks out front with pictures of both of you actually lobbying for something along those lines.
Oh, yeah.
Which was nice.
No, I think Singer's heuristic is the right one, that moral progress is generally synonymous with expanding the circle of moral concern to not just your family, not just your society, not just your race, not just your nation, but outward, to the point where ultimately you're concerned about the suffering of conscious creatures insofar as they can suffer. So it's not just humans, and it's if we discovered that pigs suffered much more than cows, well, then it would be appropriate to be more concerned about pigs than cows. And it's just that we actually care about the experience of conscious systems.
So as we do this, it seems to me that there's an issue that we probably will talk about here. No surprise to anybody, we're all pretty much politically on the left. We are godless heathens, we are atheists, we are secularists. And so are you, most of you, a good chunk. And the atheist community, the secular communities at large, have been growing leaps and bounds. The nuns are one of the fastest growing demographics. And because of that, on occasion, there is infighting. And I kept reminding people as I'd go out and talk, you know, try to listen charitably, try to mirror what people are saying, try to see nuance, but also recognize that these are natural growing pains, that it may in fact be viewed as a good thing that there are little divisions, because at one time the atheist community wasn't big enough to be able to afford risking any division the same way we did with tribes. But this idea of I'm concerned and there's a circle that radiates out produces, to me, a problem where someone else's circle is different, but they view me as if my circle should be the same. This fallacy of relative privation, that the thing that's most important or the greatest risk for them should also be the greatest risk and importance for me. And I can tell you that while, you know, Islam may be the motherlode of bad ideas and the greatest threat to freedom worldwide, it's not necessarily the greatest threat in my living room or in my neighborhood or even in Austin, Texas. How, and you guys have both experienced this, as have I, where someone on the left in the atheist movement has a mission, this is my pet thing. And anybody who doesn't fall completely in line with that gets labeled as if they're an enemy rather than that they're just not as pure an ally as they might be. How do we start, or do we start? Do we just allow the divisions to continue, or do we start building bridges and talking about this issue that what's important to you is important to me too, but it may not be as important to me because I'm dealing with this?
I think you put that very well, and I mean, it's sort of ridiculous in a way that somebody can't see that just because different people concentrate on different things, that doesn't mean that we don't think everything's important. I mean, exactly the point you've made. There are lots of different issues around which we can which we can tackle. Some of us are interested in one, some of us are interested in the other. We don't have to despise people just because they're preoccupied with a different one from us.
But I think you're also talking about disagreements in the atheist community.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing, or what I've noticed among atheists that concerns me is really seems like the consequence of identity politics on the left bleeding into the atheist community, or insofar as the atheist community skews left, it inherits a lot of the very liberal and in many cases regressive convictions of people on the left who think that to criticize Islam is tantamount to racism, say, and they don't really think too clearly about that, or that the only reason why, as an atheist, you could be more concerned about Islam than Anglicanism, say, that has to be at some level of an expression of your own hostility and xenophobia toward Arabs or people from the Middle East.
Yeah, why do you guys hate brown people so much?
Exactly.
I mean, this is the sort of oversimplification. I remember it goes back, why do you hate the troops and all these other things that were done in a humorous sense, and now they're being done in a serious sense because you two aren't as ideologically pure as I am, or you're not as ideologically pure as Sam,
But it's not just a difference of emphasis. It is to put it charitably, a difference of opinion about what it means to focus on, in this case, on Islam. But in my view, it's complete confusion about the nature of the focus and what it is that would cause someone like me or Richard to be more worried about jihadism than what the Scientologists are up to or the Mormons.
You shouldn't have said that.
I mean, I'm worried about many things, but I'm worried about some things more than others, and I accept that you might be worried about other things more than others, and they're all important.
We're also just confused by the label of atheism. That's why I think atheism is not always the best construct here. If rather than think of promulgating atheism, just think of opposing dangerous, bad ideas. And that will of necessity put you in opposition to many, many, many religious ideas, but some religious ideas aren't all that dangerous, or they're not all that well subscribed, or you barely encounter them ever, right? And so you can't really prioritize those. I am tending to prioritize the ones that are showing up in the news every day and are clearly, absolutely, there can be no doubt about this, and yet there seems to be doubt everywhere. They're clearly the proximate cause of some of the most horrific human behavior, and it is behavior that would not happen for another reason. I mean, this is another source of confusion. People think that the world is just filled with bad people who would do bad things anyway, and they're just finding religion as a pretext, right? So the Christian scientist who is not giving insulin to her diabetic daughter would do something equally crazy anyway without religion. There's no reason to think that. And
that's spot on, absolutely right.
And by the way, if you guys, we're probably pretty close to maybe bringing the house lights up a little bit and lining up to begin questions as we kind of talk about this. But what you're saying, I agree. It would be just like saying that somehow or another, the people who hate homosexuals just managed to all be part of the Westboro Baptist Church, rather than the Westboro Baptist Church cultivated these ideas. Yes. Somehow or another, when we were putting labels on things earlier, it was in the United States. It's not all Republicans are racists or are white supremacists, but pretty much all white supremacists align themselves with the Republican Party. So it would be silly to think that there's not something there that at least waters these ideas and maybe nourishes them as well.
Yeah. And the people tell us ad nauseum, these are the reasons why they're doing these things. They're not hiding their motives. So it takes a heroic act of self-deception and willful ignorance to say, despite everything these people are saying, despite the fact that they can point to the passage in the book that justifies the behavior, their behavior is coming from some other source entirely that has nothing to do with how they're accountable.
The suggestion that these are just evil people who will find a way to let their evilness come out, and if it's not religion, it's something else. They're not that evil. They're righteous people. They think they're righteous. They think they're doing good. They think they're doing the will of their God. And they think they're going to go to heaven for it. They don't think they're evil.
Well, worse than that, they're actually not evil.
Yes.
Because they're just wrong.
Yes.
Right? And you're quite right.
So I think we're at the time where we can start lining up for questions, and until the lights come up and people start taking their places, I'll kind of ramble on this point just a bit more. And that is that I think we can talk about the origins of religion, but I'm more concerned with how religion spread, which is why what I focus on, I don't necessarily go after a specific religion all the time. And of course, I'll get the email that says, why are you afraid to go after Islam? Screw you, I've made Muslims cry on my show. It's at least one. But I want to get to the crux of where these bad ideas are coming from, which is why I'm constantly advocating for skepticism, critical thinking, encouraging humanism. Because if you build the sort of communities that allow people to not feel alone, and yet encourage decency and reasonableness, I think you will have a platform that could rival what religions have done, because they co-opt families. They not only take people who are fearful of things already, thank you, and give them the sort of belief that they can get rid of their fears, but they actually encourage fictional fears that only they can cure in order to build their sense of community. It's the line, which I've said many times, that people would say, that religion poisons you and then offers you the cure, but I think it's worse than that. Religion convinces you you're poisoned when you're not, and then offers you the homeopathic remedy. But if we can't get people past the fear, the one question I get asked, or one of the questions I get asked most frequently is, when you get rid of religion, if you were to have the fantasy world that you want, Matt, and there's no more rationality, there's no more religion, what do you replace it with in order to give people hope?
Science, art, poetry, music, love, sex.
On that note, especially with sex in the mix there, I think we're good to go for questions. And it's still a little difficult for us to see folks up here. I'm going to start on the right. If you could, questions, by the way. Hey, now I can see. This is where I get to be like the asshole that I am on the TV show. Thank you. And that is, I will hang up on your ass in a heartbeat if I have to. Questions in and a question mark. They don't start with a dissertation or your life story. If you have a question for the full panel, if you have a question for all of us, we will do our best to be succinct. If you have a question for a specific person, just say so. And please just start with your name. We may not remember it, but we'll try. Please, sir.
Hey, I'm David.
Hi, David.
And my question is for Sam. All right, so my goal is to get you to nuance your opinion on free will. So in each moment, we have a neurophysical chemical moment, which is our neurons, our body, etc., and a moment within consciousness phenomena. Now, there is a kind of next universe canyon between what a neurophysical chemical moment is and what a moment of consciousness is in phenomena. So within consciousness, we experience freedom. For example, I can decide to put my hand to the right instead of to the left. So
well, that's where we disagree, but okay.
As you said,
and this is sounding like a dissertation. I will tell you this.
Consciousness is the...
I will tell you this, and then you got to get to a question. Sam and I are doing 3 more events over the next couple of months, and free will will be something that we at least discuss in private, because I think I've got a nail in the coffin for this, but
okay.
Get to the question.
So Sam, you say consciousness is the only thing we can be sure of, So because we have an experience within consciousness, which is next universe different from a neurophysical chemical moment, because we experience freedom in consciousness, hand here as opposed to there, do we have to take this feeling of freedom seriously?
There we go.
Okay, well, this is what's especially seditious about my argument against free will, because most people think we have this experience of freedom, and the trouble is it's very hard to map that onto the mere causality we see in the universe, and that's the mystery of free will. But when I look closely at my own experience, I don't see evidence of freedom. So for instance, my experience of answering this question now, of hearing myself speak, like my struggling to get to the end of this sentence, and my ability to do it or not do it based on the neurochemistry, my uncertainty about whether it is yet a grammatically complete sentence, the little stumble you just heard in my mouth on that last
Okay,
word.
forget the sentence.
Okay. No, but
decide to put your hand.
No. Just let him finish.
Absolutely everything in my experience is compatible with the absence of free will. And if you to take your example of deciding to move my right hand or my left, I could deliberate about this for a year. And if I went back, no matter how many times I went back and forth, and no matter, I could write a dissertation about why it should be the right, and then at the last second say, fuck it, I'm an existentialist. And the proximate cause of that most voluntary behavior would in every case be mysterious, subjectively mysterious. It would be pushed to the fore, and I, as the conscious witness of the process, would be a spectator. I would witness the final efficacious product of neurophysiology. And why it was one thing rather than the other, why it came at precisely that moment and not a moment before, why I just said this last sentence and didn't stop 20 seconds ago, all of that is mysterious.
But
So, no.
would you?
Well, I mean,
No, you're done. That's for Julie.
someone, well,
Reality and consciousness.
There's a ton of people in line, and we're not going to do a debate. I'm going to move
this
over.
may come up again because this is a concern of many people. But
And
thank you
you
for
can
your
rest easy in the sense that I am a la Dennett, a compatibilist who disagrees with Sam and thinks he's actually a compatibilist. He just doesn't know it. But we'll tackle that some other day. Yes, sir.
Hi, this is Armin Navabi from Atheist Republic.
Hey.
Hi.
I can recognize you.
Sam mentioned that, I don't know if he still thinks that, but atheist is a word that shouldn't even exist. Just like the word non-golfer. But if golf was forced on us, wouldn't it make sense for us to have a word like non-golfer, for non-golfers to find each other and unite against people that are pushing golf on us? And And you mentioned, well, we should fight all bad ideas, but some people want to focus on animal rights. Some people want to focus on racism. Some people want to focus on God. Isn't it, if our passion is to fight one bad idea and God is the biggest of all bad ideas, doesn't it make sense for us to have a label, to have the atheist experience, American atheists or Atheist Republic as ways to find each other and make a movement out of it?
Well, it's not that it's a mystery as to why we have the label. I mean, I understand that people find it to be a political necessity, or might find it to be a political necessity. I just don't, and I see a downside to it. And this is a place where I think Richard and I may disagree as a matter of strategy or tactics. I just see it as ultimately, I mean, yes, it is a shocking fact that not believing in God and being public about that disbelief is more or less a deal breaker politically, at least in the United States. I don't know about in Canada. That's totally unacceptable, and we should marshal some kind of political response to that, because the people who don't believe in God are, it's not an accident, some of the most informed and intelligent people in any society, because they're just following the evidence. So the fact that that's stigmatized is a problem, and it's a political problem, But I just think you can fight for science, you can fight for evidence, you can fight for reason, you can fight for logical coherence, you can fight for all of these things without ever labeling yourself. And I just have this fundamental distrust of identity politics at this point. And I don't think we win by forming our own identity.
Thank you.
My name is Barry. This is a question I'm directing at Sam and Matt because we've already got a pretty good sense of what Richard thinks of it from his book, Unweaving the Rainbow. The question is, do you feel that it is inevitable that the humanities will be hostile to the sciences? And if so, you might not agree with that, but if so, excuse me, if so, what can be done about it? Why and what can be done about it?
I don't necessarily think that there's any reason to suppose that there's a necessary hostility. I'd like to think that the more we understand the universe, the better information we have across the board, that this would improve both the sciences and the humanities.
Yeah, I mean, there's this famous notion of the two cultures that I think we're in the process of outgrowing. I think more and more a love of science. I mean, now I'm talking among well-educated people who are not being indoctrinated into one or another religious cult. But there's a love of science among people who are not themselves scientists is more and more contagious. And it's just a myth. I mean, I'm sure you can find some scientists who don't care about the rest of culture and would disparage the humanities. But for the most part, scientists they love art and music and fiction as much as anyone else. They just don't love intellectual pretension and scientific ignorance and the marriage of those two. So it's really what postmodernism did to our intellectual lives, where you had some part of every university committed to the idea that there's no such thing as truth. Yeah. And that drove a wedge, and I think we're still recovering from that. But I mean, it just comes down to not pretending to know things you don't know. So,
Amen.
You know, was Shakespeare Francis Bacon? Probably not, but I don't know, right? So it's not, why pretend to know for sure that he was Francis Bacon when the evidence is non-existent? That's a question of history. That's a question of, I guess, for scholars of literature. It's also a question of biology, really. You know, like which ape wrote those plays? So there is no real boundary between, in my view, between science and valid claims in the humanities and even journalism. I mean, we're just having a fact-based discussion about the world.
You know, and I'll kind of leverage this to go back and add an addendum to your response to Armin, where he had mentioned that, you know, why not go after God because God is the biggest, most pervasive bad idea. I'm not sure that's the case. It may be the most pervasive bad idea is that you are a reasonable judge of reality. That may be the foundational, you know, that we all assume that, oh, well, I wasn't fooled by this and I wasn't fooled by that, so I surely am not being fooled by this other thing, and yet we are. The second you think you're not being fooled, it's already too late. Yes?
Hi, my name is Robin Boostrom, and thrilled to be here tonight. So in your book, Waking Up, Sam, and this question is directed to you, you touched upon the usefulness of psychedelics in introducing people to new avenues of experience. And as our nation prepares to legalize the use of marijuana, what do you think is going to be the aggregate benefit in having people introduced to these new experiences from a drug such as marijuana?
Well, it could be a terrible mistake. I mean, I should say, you know, drug use can go many different ways, right? And it's not crazy to be concerned about a society that is just using drugs ad libitum, you know, of every sort, unconstrained by any prohibition. I mean, it's easy to see how we got to prohibition. Now, I think prohibition is really always the wrong answer, because it has all of these external effects that are terrible. It creates organized crime and black markets and creates a total lack of awareness that, quote, drugs are very different from one another, and some are addictive and just intrinsically harmful, and some aren't addictive and can be incredibly useful. So we're just misled by this one word, drugs. So what we should have is a society that prioritizes education around the pharmacology of consciousness, and is it good to drink alcohol, and who shouldn't drink alcohol, and how much alcohol is too much, and what are the health effects of drinking alcohol regularly, and that should extend to everything in our lives, and we should have an honest conversation about what seems good for human beings to be doing, and it's clear that almost any substance can be misused, and marijuana can definitely be misused. You can smoke too much and do more or less nothing else but smoke, and that's not, that's no one's conception of a life fully actualized. Or at least it shouldn't be. But prohibition is a disaster, and it was a disaster for alcohol, and we realized that 100 years ago. And yet we are still struggling to learn the same lesson with other compounds. So.
I expected much more applause when it was mentioned about legalization, and no, you're going to ruin it. I just didn't know if you were being polite to the person who asked the question, and if you're all baked. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Randy. My question is for Sam. I wanted to know what role meditation has played in your mental health. I guess, have you been more resilient to depression or anxiety? Because it seems like you're always kind of being attacked by somebody, either Batman or having Charles Murray on your podcast. Because I'm at a point where I'm kind of done with antidepressants, psychotics, mood stabilizers. We'll get there. So I want to try something new. So what's your take on meditation as a mental health treatment? Thank you.
Well, I think it can be incredibly useful. I think there are certain people who probably shouldn't go on intensive silent meditation retreats. So I think it's not, I wouldn't recommend the most intense experiences of meditation for everybody. And there are people who find, going into silence for a week or a month, destabilizing. And it's a tiny percentage of people, but you should be aware that it's possible to have a bad experience doing a lot of meditation. But no, meditation the kind of meditation I recommend is just learning to pay much more careful attention to what it's like to be you. And when you pay attention, you begin to notice all of the ways in which you are suffering unnecessarily. So there's a very, the universe didn't have to be this way, but it just so happens there is a direct connection between seeing more of what is actually happening in your own mind and ceasing to suffer in many of the ways that are unnecessary. And so honestly, it is the most important thing I've ever learned. But it's not necessary to learn most other things, right? It is kind of orthogonal to almost everything else we care about intellectually. It's not that I don't suffer in all of the ordinary ways I suffered before I learned to meditate, but the half-life of suffering, the half-life of something like anger or anxiety or embarrassment or fear or whatever the negative mindset is, it's cut way down, and also the behavioral consequences of those negative emotions. The door is closed to those. When you think of the difference between being angry for 10 seconds and then actually letting it go and being angry for an hour, right? It's an enormous difference, because in that hour you can get up to doing all kinds of life-deranging things on the basis of anger and feel good about doing those things, right? Because you damn well should be doing those things because you're pissed. And so just shortening the time course of all of these negative states is an enormous benefit, and meditation is a great tool for that.
Although sometimes when I'm angry, that's when I'm most productive.
Then you can.
But I was wondering,
sublimate it.
I know the question was directed to Sam, but just for my curiosity, I don't know if Richard, have you explored meditation in the way that Sam's talking about at all?
I did once do a course in transcendental meditation. I'm sorry to say it did absolutely nothing for me.
Well, on a somber note, I would argue that transcendental meditation, at least in some sense, killed Doug Henning, which will make me pissed off at transcendental meditation, at least until I can meditate to let go. But yes.
Hi, my name is Leah, and I just want to say welcome so much to Sam and Richard, both to coming back to Vancouver. And I would just say on meditation, Sam recommended that I do a 10-day meditation retreat, and all I can say is it did wonders for my marriage that I was quiet for 10 days. So my question is future focused, and in two parts. So you had me at hello with atheism. You have had me at hello with your book, Waking Up on Consciousness. I very much agree that it just sure looks to be a lot better to focus on how we can actually just be better and nicer and focus on those qualities that are measurable. And I have a question. The first part is, what are the biological or societal hurdles or roadblocks that we need to get past in our evolution as humans to do more of that? I already agree that, religion hasn't helped, but what are the other sort of case studies that you can pull up biologically or culturally that we could use to make this faster? And secondly, it strikes me that the second part is resource allocation has been a challenge, and that's been one of the drivers of tribalism, is that in the quest for resources, we've not been nice to each other. Given the abundance that we are seeing that technology is creating and sort of the democratization of that abundance, will that solve some of these problems and leapfrog us ahead in evolution?
I find your questions as long and leading as mine.
Well, briefly, I mean, there's a lot there, but I think one of the greatest problems we have, and there's an obvious, this connects directly to what Richard was saying about evolution, the evolution of tribalism. Our morality, most people's morality is anchored to social emotions and quintessentially moral emotions that are not good guides for living a good life or building a good society. I mean, emotions like disgust, right? I mean, so some people find homosexuality disgusting, or the idea of gay sex disgusting, and that is the end of the argument for them, right? It's like that is enough to pass laws on. In a theocracy, that's enough to justify throwing people off the top of buildings. So disgust is a very bad guide for morality, and desire is a bad guide as well. I mean, we have things like lust and disgust and fear and xenophobia, which is just fear in a certain context. We have to be able to have a reasoned conception of the good life, both personally and collectively, that gets beneath these ape-driven limbic arousal non-arguments, which is how all of our moral thinking gets coded psychologically, and that's it's a problem. And we get, you can see every conversation about a charged issue leading people to get emotionally hijacked in the midst of the conversation, and then they're not processing arguments anymore. And so we have to find mechanisms to get around that. And on the final question on just resource allocation, one of these moral emotions that we have, if you imagine a world of real abundance, like a world where we've built the right AI that's just pulling wealth out of the atmosphere, and no one really has to work anymore, right? Because we literally have machines that can build machines that are all powered by sunlight, that do everything better than we can. Now, why wouldn't that be some kind of utopia? Well, it wouldn't be a utopia because we have these very weird emotions, or many of us do, that make it seem like it would be wrong to spread the wealth around. It would be right, like most people are living as though they want to live in a world where there's a few trillionaires living in compounds ringed by razor wire, and everyone else is sort of starving to death. It's like a winner-take-all scenario. And so we have to find a new ethic whereby people are no longer, their purchase on existence is no longer justified by doing profitable work that other people will pay them for. I mean, we have, in a world of true abundance, you shouldn't have to work to justify your life. You should be free to enjoy the wealth of the world. And if we're going to get to that place, we have to change our ethics around that.
Hi, I'm Kumaran. My name is Kumaran. Quick question, mainly to Sam, but I guess it applies to others as well. You've talked a little bit about how you've gotten some strange bedfellows by some of your views on Islam, for example, have resulted in people that you may not agree with that are essentially just xenophobic, sort of following you and becoming sort of part of your fan base, or whatever you'd call it. And similarly, you wrote a letter to a couple of feminists a few years ago that got in an argument with you that has been requoted pretty extensively by people in sort of the more red pill, kind of crazy men's movement crowd. How do you think about those things in terms of, I know that you don't agree with those actual views espoused there, but you know, especially in the world of social media, you start getting yourself, you know, it's hard sometimes where the tail can wag the dog over time if people...
I'm embarrassed to say I don't even remember what you're referring to in terms of the letter to feminists. Was this my blog post, I'm not the sexist pig you're looking for?
Yes, exactly. That was it.
Yeah.
That was it.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's just you can't fully explain yourself and close the door to every possible misrepresentation of your utterances in every single utterance, right? So you can't condense a book into a paragraph, and you can't condense a paragraph into a single sentence every time. I mean, maybe you can occasionally do it, but it's just if people are determined to take your words out of context in a way that is designed to mislead people as to what they actually meant in context, there is no way to prevent that. I'm just convinced that it's impossible to prevent that. Now, I can be much more careful than I've been in some, and I am more careful than I was in some of my earlier books now in general, because I'm less interested in writing something that's provocative and entertaining, and I'm more interested in not experiencing this deluge of misrepresentation. So I am more careful than I used to be, but it's still impossible. I mean, and so it's not. I can't take it seriously if somebody creates some meme that completely misrepresents my view, and then some Nazi nutcase likes it. I don't know what to do with that.
So Richard's dealt with this with regard to the fleas and your detractors. How much attention do you pay to the people who are saying negative things about you or trying to misrepresent what you've said, and versus how much do you let your words stand on their own?
Well, Sam is absolutely right, of course, that it's extremely hard to condense a paragraph down to 144 words, whatever it is, the characters. And in some cases, misunderstanding with hindsight can be understood. You can see where the misunderstanding came from. In other cases, I suspect there's a kind of active searching for the opportunity to misunderstand, active searching for offense. I think there are offense junkies who just love to be offended. I agree with Sam that we have to be careful. You can't rely upon people interpreting your words in the way that you intended them to be interpreted, and you must have to expect that quite a lot of people are going to misunderstand, in some cases possibly even deliberately misunderstand, which is sad.
This is why the principle of charity is so important. If you actually want to understand somebody's position, then you will always be interested in their efforts to clarify it, right? But what we're noticing in our discourse, politically especially, is people don't really want to understand your position. They want to catch you saying something that can be construed in the worst possible way and then hold you to it. And then they claim to understand what you think better than you do, right? They pretend to be mind readers.
That's among the many things that I caution people about, is don't pretend you can read people's minds or their motivations. Even those of us who pretend to do it on stage, we're just fake and we're not as good at it. I used to toil over this, and it would basically what I've stopped doing by means of a solution is I pretty much don't read any comments that come in on YouTube. Maybe a couple over the first day or so, just to make sure I didn't post a video that didn't have audio, or the famous "my left ear loved this" because I didn't convert the single channel to mono. But for me, the line's really simple. I've stated my position. Somebody either didn't understand it or found fault with it. If there's fault, I'll keep going back and forth as long as somebody's making a reasonable case for what they think is wrong with it, because that's a debate. That's what I do. If I've explained it and explained it again, and now it's just getting in the way of me actually getting work done and reaching the people who already understood this and may understood the next 5 or 6 things, if it's getting in the way of me learning something from somebody else, if I'm just sitting there spinning my wheels, now it's no longer worth my time, because that person may not be reachable at all, but they're clearly not reachable by me right now, so I'm going to leave it for somebody else because I've got better things to do most of the time.
Thank you. My name is Dan. I'm from Calgary. Sam, I find your books, your podcasts, and your talks are kind of like a torch of reason for civilization in some sense. And yeah, I just wanted to first send our appreciation for that. Thank you.
Cool, thank you.
My questions to Richard and Sam. What was it like to stand on stage next to Christopher Hitchens?
I suppose he was the most eloquent speaker I ever heard. Had a magnificent voice, which he deployed beautifully, had amazing resources in terms of memory, in terms of quotations, in terms of historical allusions, reading. I once wrote, if you are invited to have a debate against Christopher Hitchens, decline. But he was, even as he was a ruthless debater, nevertheless he was also very courteous, and he would go and have a drink with his victim after slaughtering him. I didn't agree with him about everything, but if you wanted to disagree with him, you better be well prepared with arguments, because he's a very, very hard person to argue against. A wonderful gentleman, much missed.
Yeah, I obviously he was incredibly articulate, and it was amazing and incredibly fun, but also somewhat galling to hear someone speak exactly as he wrote. And he was such a good writer. And the stories about him apparently are true. He could just go, and just type 1,000 words, and it wouldn't require any editing, and that would be his next essay. So
who would dare edit?
He was amazing. Yeah, but even he wouldn't dare edit. Apparently, he just got it right the first time. So I just, as you were asking the question, I just recalled that he had made the point I was just trying to make at great length about people pretending to know what you think better than you do and not actually wanting to hear your position. And he said he was, I'm going to butcher his quote, even trying to remember it, but he said he felt he was constantly surrounded by people who, in detecting your lowest possible motive, were convinced they had found your only possible motive. And even that isn't quite right, but that's basically that. He was remarkably clear on just a breadth of issues that was just amazing to consider. And you should read his books if you haven't. Read Hitch 22. Read God Is Not Great if you haven't. Read Hitch 22 to understand what a life he led. I mean, the kinds of the people he met and the amount of fun he had. I mean, he loved this. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to be here and talk to all of you. It's an honor to be here. and it's always an honor to share the stage with Richard. But Hitch loved this experience. I mean, he would just get on the road to talk to people, and his love of it was palpable. And so I did one book tour, and as signing books, half the people who came up during that book tour were just expressing appreciation for Hitch. I mean, this was before he died, but his cancer was known, and it was amazing to be on the receiving end of that love for him and his work, and it was being driven by him because he really loved this.
Hi, I'm Aaron. So Richard, in one of your books, you wrote about the moral zeitgeist and how morality has evolved through time. And Sam, in some of your recent podcasts, you've had Charles Murray and you've had Cass Sunstein on your show, and you've talked about polarization and groupthink and how today, especially in the world of social media and Amazon and news, so often our views are reinforced and self-fulfilling in their way. So I'm curious your thoughts on the advancement of the moral zeitgeist in a time where we are constantly reinforcing our own ideas and the tools that we have at our disposal to cross boundaries there, and potentially, if we are all digesting media, say that is self-fulfilling, should government maybe have a role in helping advance this further, as that is a tool that is still national, that is still across all people, potentially?
Well, I'm interested in the moral zeitgeist because people often talk about religion as a necessary basis for morality. And I think that's fairly easily refuted by pointing out that the current, not just deep morals, but little details, little superficial details, like the amount of different kinds of prejudices that there are on things. These things change from decade to decade, let alone from century to century. And this is sort of documented in books like Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, where we are clearly getting better, getting nicer as the centuries go by. And this has nothing to do with religion. The moral attitudes of somebody in 2017, label them as 2017 as opposed to just 50 years ago when they would have been subtly different. There would have been more racism, more sexism, and it prompts the thought of what's going to happen in 50 years, 100 years' time, I suppose. But the moral zeitgeist changes in ways that have nothing to do with religion. It's hard to say what they are due to. It's tempting to use a phrase like something in the air, whatever that means, but it almost feels as though it is that, a sort of consensus of journalism and political discussion and legal cases and books and dinner party discussions in pubs. We just kind of move on steadily pretty much in one direction. That's what I mean by the shifting moral zeitgeist.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to behavioral economics. I think if you get the incentives right, even pretty mediocre people can behave really well. If the incentives are wrong, it takes an absolute moral hero to behave well. And we should want to design societies and systems and institutions where you don't actually have to wake up every morning and be, St. Francis of Assisi just to get through your day without killing somebody, right? And there are conditions where you basically have to be that. You have to be a saint not to be absolutely vile. I mean, when you look at just how people have to live in maximum security prisons, the incentives there are all wrong. They're all pushing people toward most brutal tribalism. Even if you're not a racist, you have to align yourself with your race in a prison. Otherwise, you're just going to be the victim of everyone, right? So we want systems and societies that are less and less like maximum security prisons, and we're still just trying to find our way toward to engineering those, and we don't have 1,000 years to get it right.
Hi, my name's Blaine. very close to the microphone. I'm very excited to be here. And my question is for Richard, although I hope Sam may be tempted to add something as well. What are your thoughts on the Darwinian roots of creativity? And what neurological investigation might we do to learn how to program this into AI?
I think it's remarkable how far humanity in civilized situations has advanced beyond what anyone would have predicted from our Darwinian roots. We are African apes, naturally selected to survive on the African plains as hunter-gatherers, and somehow nowadays we produce Shakespeare and Beethoven and great scientists, because there's a lot of creativity in science as well, of course. We do seem to have brains that are laced with emergent properties which go far beyond what naively you might think you'd need for Darwinian survival. And this builds cumulatively over generations of cultural evolution, where each generation builds on the culture of the previous one. So that's not a Darwinian process, that's a kind of pseudo-Darwinian process. It's an evolutionary process that doesn't work by natural selection, at least not by genetic natural selection. It might work by some other kind of cultural natural selection. It's not an easy thing to say that creativity, as we understand it today, would have had survival value. I would think that perhaps a sort of brain, a neurophysiological equivalent of what we call creativity today might have had survival value of a very different kind when we were subject to the cutting edge of natural selection.
Would it be something in the line of, I tend to look at creativity as branching out from cleverness, of problem solving, of non-lateral thinking and problem solving. That clearly has an advantage, being able to find better ways to build a mousetrap. Wouldn't that, I mean...
Yes, I mean, having ideas, having hypotheses, if it's, how are we going to capture a buffalo? I mean, you could be sort of creative about that. You can have ideas, you can have, but you can make suggestions which are then knocked down. So that's the kind of creativity. But somehow it's flowered into something so hugely greater than was ever directly useful.
Wouldn't it be terrifying if the way creativity has changed is actually the reason why we haven't tackled as many of the problems? We used to have to solve problems to survive, and now we're enjoying our creativity, which may be preventing us from solving the problems that are right in front of our face right now. Mm-hmm. I'm not knocking the arts. Just thinking out loud.
Yeah, on the question of whether AI is already doing it in rudimentary ways, in game playing, for instance, be it in chess or Go or even in just basic video games that AI is playing. It's finding creative moves that masters of those games
composing music in the style of Mozart.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't think there's anything magical about our wetware as far as creativity goes. I think we'll recognize it in our intelligent systems insofar as they become intelligent.
So at this point, I'm going to be the bearer of bad news to some people. We have about 5 minutes left for Q&A. So that, at the current pace, if you're more than like a person or two back in line, we are probably not going to get to you, but go ahead.
Sam, I love you!
Thank you.
That's not a question.
My name is Peter. Thank you for being here. Sam, you often speak about the importance of intuition. You had a podcast with Gavin de Becker that placed intuition front and center in a life-saving way for many people. And yet, in the person of President Trump, and this question is not about him, we see the dark side of intuition, a man who says that his gut guides everything he does. And so that's got those of us who believe in intuition feeling a bit shaky. Can you please reassure us from an evolutionary standpoint or otherwise that intuition is something we can value? Thanks.
Well, it sort of depends on what you mean by intuition. For me, intuition is when you can break down your knowledge of a thing no further, the step you take is intuitive. So if I ask you, how is it that you understand that 2 + 2 makes 4, right? So at some point you were taught this, but now you get it and you can't see it any other way. And when someone says 2 + 2 makes 5, that doesn't feel right. No, it makes 4. You believe it. You know it. It's a mathematical intuition at this point. It's basic. It's a basic building block of anything. If I told you, I have a bag here and I put 2 oranges in it, and then I put 2 more oranges in it, you'd helplessly form a picture of there being 4 oranges in there. And if I told you, oh no, there's 6 in here, well then something didn't add up, right? And this is, our knowledge of the world, our knowledge of causality, our knowledge of anything, our sense that the present bears some relationship, however lawful, to the past, all of that is cashed out intuitively. And so you can't get away from intuition. Everything is built on it, from basic logic and mathematics on up. But we recognize that many of our intuitions are bad. They're faulty. We did not evolve to have common sense intuitions about the way the universe works, especially at the smallest scale of atoms, and especially at the largest scale of galaxies, and especially across vast stretches of time when you're talking about billions of years. So we know there are areas where our intuitions are very, very bad, and we correct for them with other intuitions that allow us to correct for them, like mathematical ones, where, this is an example I gave, I think, in my first book, but if I asked you, if we had a newspaper the size of this stage, and we could just fold it in half again and again and again, and we folded it in half 100 times, how thick would the resulting block of newspaper be? Well, most people, if you imagine it being the size of this stage, they imagine you would be able to fold it in half upon itself 100 times. And they imagine something maybe the size of a cinder block or a very large brick. But you fold a newspaper in half 100 times, what you have in your hands is measured in light years, right? I mean, I forget exactly what it is, but it's probably bigger than the galaxy. So that's a very bad intuition we have there. But the intuition that allows us to recognize that it's bad is that this very simple mathematical operation of exponentiation actually works, right? That if you raise something to the 100th power, 2 to the 100th power, and multiply by the thickness of a newspaper, you have a very big number. So intuition gets stigmatized as a word, but science is the product of intuition, and every gesture toward knowledge is the product of intuition at bottom.
I did that paper folding demonstration when I gave the Royal Institution Christmas lectures. Children come out, and you can't get more than 7 folds. It stops there. But I mean, I think the purport of the question, by mentioning Trump, is that when you have 2 people whose intuition differs, then you can't argue by saying, well, that's my intuition, that's my intuition. I feel this, I feel that. That's what's really dangerous. And we want to get away from that kind of thing in public policy, in government. We do not want people who just do things because they feel that it just feels right to them.
Yeah. But which is to say that you need an argument, but my noticing whether or not your argument runs through is again based on logical intuition.
That's a much more sophisticated point, and
but
one that President Trump wouldn't get, by the way.
No, I wasn't focusing on Trump, but.
And we'll have to save that for another time too, because when Sammy mentioned that intuition is the foundation of logic, I think it's the reverse. That logic and mathematics, these things are where we're making direct appeals to the facts of the universe. But we use critical thinking, we use this examination to train our intuition. You can get better.
Yeah, you can get better, but
your intuition can improve. And so when you have, as Richard was pointing out, you have 2 people whose intuitions are in conflict, the solution is never going to be a third intuition. It's going to be, let's make an appeal to the evidence and retrain everybody's intuition.
It's often a third intuition. I mean, often you bring in the mathematician who actually knows what he's talking about. And
I wouldn't call that intuition.
But again, the intuition intuition is this move that you can't justify without pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. I mean, if I said to you, well, justify this idea that events need causes, the sense that when something happens, there must be some causal explanation for it happening. That's an intuition that is deeply held, and that's the foundation of science. And there are actually areas in science that seem to violate it, right? And then we're left actually not understanding what's going on, but we have other reasons to protect that area of confusion because, in the case of something like quantum mechanics, it just works. It has such predictive utility that even though we don't have a clear, realistic picture of what's happening, we have to say, in some sense, this is the math works out and it's right. But these areas of science are less than perfectly satisfying because we're struggling to form a picture of reality, and our intuitions we don't have the right intuitions for it, and that's not a surprise because we, after all, are apes first.
African apes.
Yes, African.
I think there's a lot more to explore there. Unfortunately, I've been told that our time with all you fine people is actually up for this evening. I can't even do that. I'm getting directions from off the stage that we've reached the end of the evening.
Well,
that's high. That's high.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
I don't know who killed the lights, and I'm sure that the two of you would like to see our beautiful audience again as we say goodnight. Thank you so much, Vancouver. Thank you to Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Pangburn Philosophy.
If you're enjoying the Waking Up podcast, there are many ways you can support it at samharris.org/support. As a supporter of the podcast, you'll get early access to tickets to my live events, and you'll get exclusive access to my Ask Me Anything episodes, as well as to the AMA page on my website, where you can pose questions and vote on the questions of others. And please know that your support is greatly appreciated. It's listeners like you that make this show possible.